All right, now that you have finished trial 1 of the Slingshot science experiment, it's time to analyze your data and be able to create a visual of your data. So you need to use your data analysis paper to make 2 different graphs. Make sure you click the button below to get all of the necessary success criteria for the 2 different graphs. I will also provide which different variables go on the different axes. But to show you an example here of what these graphs could end up looking like, let's take a look at graph 1 and let's just see what graph 1 could end up looking like. So for the x-axis, I'm saying that we're going to put force on the x-axis and then make sure that you include the units. So whether you use pounds or newtons, let's just say that this one was newtons, so I'm going to put newtons in parentheses. The y-axis is going to be the distance that was measured, and we'll say the distance was in meters. So depending on what units you used in your experiment is what you'll add for the units on those axes. Now you launched 3 different masses, and let's say that the 3 masses that you launched were a baseball. So we'll use the letter B for a baseball on my graph. We'll say that you also launched a tennis ball. And let's say then you also launched a shot put, or maybe a bowling ball or something, but we'll use these 3. So since I'm going to use these 3 letters in order to show my data on this graph, I'm going to just turn this into my key so that I know, or my viewer knows exactly what they're looking at on my graph. So let's say that once you have your axes labeled, make sure you add the numbers to your grid lines here. I'm not going to do that here because I'm just going to be making some estimates. So let's say that you launch the baseball with just a little bit of force, and so it just goes a little bit of distance. I would put a letter B there. Now the second time I launched the baseball with a little bit more force, and it went even further. So therefore, I'd look down here, maybe I launched it with more force than I did the first time, and maybe it went a further distance. So then I would draw a letter B out here. Now let's say that the third time I launched it with a lot more force than I did the last time. Let's say it went much, much further. Now, since these are all baseball measurements for changing the force to see how far they went, I'm going to connect all 3 of those quote-unquote dots there. Now, let's do the same thing for the tennis ball. So the tennis ball weighs a little bit less, so if I apply the same amount of force, I'm going to guess that it would go a little bit further. When I apply the next level of force, it's going to go, let's say, a further distance than it did the first time. When I apply that last amount of force, let's say it's going to go even further than the baseball did. And so I'm going to then connect the dots for my tennis ball. Now a shot put is quite a bit different. A shot put weighs a lot more than a baseball or a tennis ball. So if I apply just a little bit of force, let's say that the shot put hardly even goes past the slingshot. The next time I apply force, it just goes a few meters, and when I apply the most amount of force, we'll say that the shot put finally moved a little bit, but not very much at all. So I would then connect the lines for the shot put. So you can get an idea of what this graph would look like. So make sure that you label your axes, you include the units, that each graph has a title and a key, and that the 3 lines can be clean, and I can actually read those 3 lines. So the one thing that this graph is missing is a title. Graph 1 does not count as the title. So instead, I could say something along the lines of what I'm looking at here. And what I'm looking at is I have 3 different masses. So I could say something like 3 different masses. And they were launched for the slingshot, but they were launched at 3 different levels of force. So I could say 3 different masses launched by a slingshot at 3 different levels of force. So that would be describing what's on this data table, and so that's the type of title that I'm looking for. So use this information for graph 1 and graph 2, and make sure you use the success criteria to make sure you have the axes correct. See ya.